unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Since independence, the Indian state has grappled with a variety of internal security challenges: insurgencies, terrorist attacks, caste and communal violence, riots, and electoral violence. Their toll has claimed more lives than all of India's 5 external wars combined. Despite this, we know surprisingly little about the institutions of the state tasked with managing internal security. For instance, how well has India contained violence and preserved order? How have the approaches and capacity of the state evolved to obtain these twin objectives? And what impact does the state's approach have on civil liberties and the quality of democracy? These are 3 questions that a new book, Internal Security in India, Violence, Order, and the State, takes up. It's an important new volume co-edited by 2 of the best-known political scientists working on India, Amit Ahuja and Devesh Kapur. Over 15 chapters, Amit and Devesh bring together some of the best scholars and practitioners working in the field in a book that I predict will have a very, very long shelf life. To talk more about India's internal security, Amit and Devesh join me on the show today from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, congrats to you both, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Milan.
Thank you so much, Milan, and thank you for such a kind introduction.
So, Amit, let me start with you. In the acknowledgments section at the very start of the book, you note that this volume began with the conversation that you and Devesh had before the pandemic back in 2018 about India's internal security. And I'm wondering if you can kind of, share with us and our listeners a little bit about that conversation and, how did it lead to the book that you produced today?
Yeah, no, thank you. You're right. So it actually began with this conversation at the India Security Workshop that Devesh hosts. And, during our, our separate projects, I was actually looking at violent indicators of insurgency violence and drawing these graphs for my class using the South Asia Terrorism Portal data, and began to notice that across insurgencies, the violence had just begun to dip. Devesh was looking at insurgencies in a project that he was researching, and so these conversations began with a discussion on what is really happening to violence in India. And, we had a sense that communal violence, those patterns had begun to shift. So we wanted to, that's what got us started. And then what I had begun to notice there was that how the military had configured itself to take on insurgencies. And it was a pretty significant, reconfiguration, raising an entire organization with the membership of 75,000 soldiers. Devesh at that time was looking at the structure of the Central Armed Police Forces and how they had been bulking up in terms of numbers over the decades. So both in terms of the story of violence and what the state was doing to increase its capacity, that's what the conversation was about. And that's what got us started thinking. But, Milan, you worked with Devesh, and you know that he is a force of nature. And to have him, it's because it's one thing to have conversation and have ideas. And it's a completely different thing to take this project through. And working with Devesh and just, his relentlessness, has brought us to this stage. So I want to embarrass him a little bit by definitely noting that.
You both note in the outset of the book that you take a very statist view of security production. In other words, you're not really interested in this book so much in kind of political and societal actors, but rather trying to unpack the kind of black box, as it were, of the state and all of its various institutions, right? And in doing that, you kind of note this paradox. On the one hand, law and order under the Constitution is a state subject, right? It is state capitals who have original jurisdiction over questions of law and order. But on the other hand, the enhancement of internal security-related security forces has been concentrated in New Delhi and has arguably served to bolster centralization. I'm wondering if you could just kind of help us explain these 2 bits of the picture.
So, Milan, that's a very nice point. You might recall that you and I actually had written a paper for a Carnegie volume, I think in 2014, where we looked at the supply chain of law and order. And, you know, I think it's been noticed not just by us, but by many other commentators, just how much or how little the states invest in law and order. So, this whole thing of very large vacancies in the police, the district courts, the sort of the expenditure patterns, which are only on wages and salaries, hardly anything on equipment and training, and so on and so forth. In many ways, the centralization that has happened is, I think, part of a broader, phenomenon. Core public goods, and law and order is a core public good, constitutionally were entrusted with states, right? Local roads, health, primary education, right? These are examples. In all of them, the states fail to discharge their core obligations. In all of them, as we know with primary education, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan was the one that really put in much more money. In sort of rural roads, again, a massive central scheme. Drinking water, again, a massive central scheme. Law and order is the same. The centralization has occurred in substantial part because of the abdication of responsibilities of the states to their core constitutional obligations. And over time, for anything, they would ask central forces to be sent over. Now, the more they've relied on the center, it's led to the centralization of power and greater concentration of power in the center. That power was not taken by the center, it was given to the center by the states.
I mean, it's a very interesting point you make, because at the same time, this abdication you speak of, it coexists with this idea that politicians really care about controlling security forces at the state level, right? To go after their political opponents, to make sure that their colleagues and cronies are protected. So it's a bit of a kind of Janus face enterprise, isn't it? On the one hand, abdication, but then excessive control, perhaps in a way, however, I think is maybe what you're arguing, that's not building state capacity.
Absolutely. So see, the recourse to central forces is done when there is mass violence, public sort of order is under threat. Police is much more controlled by the states for quotidian criminal activities, right? And that, as your wonderful book sort of showed, the nexus between politics and criminals, the fact that so many MLAs and MPs have people who have this unbelievable number of charges against them, ranging from murder and rape. So what states want to really control is the police, especially when it comes to criminal investigations. When it comes to order, which is large scale violence, right? On that, they rely on central forces. And of course, large scale violence often breaks down precisely because of the shenanigans of the state governments in multiple ways.
So, Devesh, let me just stick with you for a moment, and maybe Amit wants to come in on this as well after. One theme of the introductory chapter that you two have written is that, as best as we can measure as sort of social scientists, public violence of all kinds appears to be on the decline, right? So it doesn't matter if it's riots, murders, terrorism, insurgency, all of them point in the same direction, which is downwards. Tell us a little bit about the kind of dimensions of the data that you've been able to amass, because it's a story that I think a lot of people would be surprised to read, given what they often see in the headlines, for instance.
No, I think it's something that really surprised us, Milan, that in almost every measure of public violence, you see an inverted U curve. You see an increase from the 60s to about the 90s, and then a decline, right? So this has spanned all the governments. To add to some of the list which you have, take student unrest, take labor strife, right? You see, incredible increase from the 60s to the 90s to the 80s in the case of both student and labor. In fact, this goes back almost to the late 50s. The first major works of scholarship by American political scientists in the late 50s, early 60s, Myron Wiener, the Rudolphs, was actually on student, protests in India, surprisingly. That had begun by the late 50s. You have the first parliamentary reports on this. And what struck them was not that, there was student protests that happens all over the world, but how much violence accompanied student protests. India really stood out. By the late 80s, student protests were about 10,000 a year. This is official records, of which about between a fifth and one fourth were violent. So almost 8 to 10 every day, which is quite remarkable. And then, last 20 years, huge decline. Same thing with sort of labor protests and violence. Hijackings, we don't think about that, but there were, from the 70s to the 90s, there were all these hijackings that would occur. Again, it's vanished. So assassinations, if you remember, Mrs. Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, all of that, again, that has gone. Something that you see a mirror image of that, security force fatalities. You see, which is there's more violence, you bring in security forces, they'll have, fatalities. That also has this inverse U curve. Uh, we're trying to put together, new data on police firings, right? Because when there's a lot of public violence, that's what happens. That has also declined. So all of these are consistent with this rise and decline of public violence. What we don't have in the book, and I think we are still grappling with that, there is no one reason that explains this all. For instance, on student protests, one feature we see in higher education, much more of higher education is now private. So when students are paying a lot of money, then actually going on strikes, etc., does cost you in the pocket, right? Don't pay, it doesn't really matter, right? Uh, Labor unrest has declined because organized labor's powers worldwide has declined, right? Capital's power has sort of increased. Hijackings have declined because you see it's almost a parallel with what happened to the US after 9/11, right? You see a massive growth in the Department of Homeland Security as airport security now gets centralized under a federal agency. Same thing happened in India. Airport security was provided by state police, which is not very competent, not well trained, and it shifted to the central CISF, which is a central government entity, which was sort of better trained for the specific task of airport security. So it's a combination of reasons why we think we observe these patterns. But I think what we are confident, because all of them follow pretty similar patterns, we are pretty confident of our at least empirical findings.
Okay, if I can just come in a little bit on that. Yeah, so I just want to sort of, highlight a few things here. One is that, these, indicators of violence that we see across the board. I mean, Milan, we know that people who have studied these have looked at these in isolation. But if you look at them, take a sort of 30,000 feet view and see multiple indicators of violence going down, that then begins to have a very profound effect on society and state-society relations. And I think that's something we need to appreciate. I'll just give you one example. Think about electoral violence and how much it has plummeted from the 1970s and 80s into the 90s, and what it has done. Participation has gone up. Most importantly, if you look at the Indian state's efforts to secure the polling station, the polling booth, and what it has allowed, for when it comes to voters from marginalized or subordinate groups, they are now going and voting in large numbers as compared to the time when they went to the polling station, they were just told, go home, your vote has been cast. Today, every polling station has 5 central police officials who guard it. So it has serious implications in that regard. That's one point. Another thing I think which we need to remember is how sharply different India's experience has been as compared to other developing countries in Africa, in Latin America, where violence has just taken off. It's just those numbers have just exploded. And in that respect, whether when we compare to what's happened in the subcontinent, in India's neighborhood, as well as to some of the major countries like Nigeria, South Africa, other parts of Africa, Brazil, Mexico, and you can see that India's had very serious challenges when it comes to violence, and the state has been able to overcome some of those challenges, and so that India's performance in that respect is actually it stands out.
So, Amit, could I just kind of follow up on this, because one big caveat here, and you're transparent about this in the chapter, is that your focus is really on mass violence, right? And you note that there are some signs of everyday forms of violence that are increasing, right? And maybe you could just say a word about that. What are the kinds of individual or everyday violence that appear to perhaps be rising instead of declining?
So what we actually see is that we sort of make this observation on communalism. And what we say actually is that, if you look at the, data on riots, on communal violence, or you look at the incidence of major acts of mass violence, and I'm thinking Nelly, I think 1983, 1984 in Delhi, the violence we saw, 1993 in Mumbai, 2002 in Gujarat, those kinds of acts, and in general, violence related to riots and ethnic violence has come down. What we see today is that when it comes to everyday communalism, we see that this appears more regularly. We don't have systematic data on it, and so we can't claim that this kind of activity is increasing. This data has to be collected for us to make any sort of comparison of the type that we've made for other indicators. And here, the important point, in fact, there are two really important things that we need to realize. One is that a lot of what we are seeing is getting amplified because of social media. Incidents happen, videos are produced, sometimes they are real, sometimes they are fake, but they travel across the country in no time. And that makes them dangerous. Why? Because they perpetuate fear, they encourage conflict, and if the state doesn't act swiftly, then there are consequences to these kind of videos, being circulated in society. And second is this notion, this perception of vigilante groups who it seemed to be able to get away with violence. Now, this could be related to cattle smuggling in North India, interfaith marriages, the kind of political violence we see in Bengal, for example. But the fact is that, if vigilantes are seen to be getting away with violence, if there's that level of impunity, then the state is beginning to share its monopoly over violence, its authority with other actors. And we know this from our experience in India and from elsewhere in the world, that when states do that, when they share this authority, they begin to lose legitimacy. And that's something that we need to keep an eye on as social scientists. In terms of what how are these activities being perceived, and what is it doing to the respect for the credibility of the state.
One thing where you see this is of lynching, right? We've seen this undoubtedly increase in this last few years. Now, unlike the mass violence that Amit alluded to, you know, uh, Delhi 84, Nelly, Godhra, and post Godhra in Gujarat in 2002, lynching kills a few individuals. It doesn't kill people in the hundreds or thousands, right? Now, the work in the American South, right, where you had lynching, it shows that lynching is more akin to terrorism. Terrorism doesn't kill that many people because the whole point of terrorism is to sow widespread fear. And so, in that sense, this type of so what it does is it increases sharply the perception of violence. So that's why.
Right. It's a sort of performative act in a sense.
Exactly, exactly. The other area where I think there is a sense of increased violence is around gender, because of very highly publicized cases, the very palpable sense of lack of safety, like for women in public spaces. Now, here actually, you know, we cannot make any unequivocal statement because most violence against women occurs in private spaces, which is inside the household. And as you well know, it's very, very hard to get good, at least long term data on that. And I think that's the other area where there is clearly at least a perception of of sort of violence. Now, but I don't think we can have any unequivocal sense of what is the long term trend on that.
So Devesh, let me just kind of shift the conversation a bit from data to kind of institutions, right? Because the book spends some time going through the institutional framework for internal security. In fact, many of the chapters are really oriented around that. One of the key actors clearly is the Home Ministry, which is the nodal agency for law enforcement. And in your chapter, you document a real expansion in the ministry's ambit over the years, particularly when it comes to the explosion in the size of the central armed police forces and other central police organizations. And just give us a taste, if you could, about how large has this growth been over the decades? I mean, how significant are the numbers?
So, Milan, the Indian states after the liberalization of the 90s, the central government, the only part that has really seriously expanded is the Home Ministry. The Central Armed Police Forces were roughly about 5,000 in the early mid 50s, about 60,000 around the late 60s, half a million by 1990, and about 1 million now, right? So it's a massive expansion. Uh, you know, Even till the late 60s, the ratio of the what are now called the Central Armed Police Forces to the army, the ratio was 1 to 10. Today, it's close to 1 to 1. Now, there is no doubt that this has hugely expanded the ambit and the power of the Home Ministry. And of course, currently, uh, given the particular relationship between this Home Minister and the Prime Minister, it's even more so. Uh, now, now, it is true that much of this expansion occurred for very specific reasons in reaction to some things that happened. So, for instance, till the 65 war with Pakistan, uh, the borders on, say, in many of the states, the borders were actually controlled by the state police. What happened in 65, there was infiltration in the Rann of Kutch instead of Gujarat, etc. And slowly there was a realization that you needed some centralized forces. So that's where you see the expansion of the border security force. After the 62 war with China, this large, you know, 3,000 kilometer plus border with China, it was clear that India needed a force like for that. And that's how you saw the creation of the ITBP. The CISF was created in the late 60s when left front governments came to power in Kerala and West Bengal and refused to protect central installations against attacks by sort of different forces. So it was created to protect central institutions, and over time its ambit expanded to provide security at airports, etc., etc. After the horrific sort of Mumbai attacks on 26/11, when it was clear that there was a massive intelligence failure, you see the creation of the NIA, the National Intelligence Agency. So you see that after each of these, you see a new force created for particular purposes and a gradual expansion. But I think this larger thing, what does it all amount to when you have so many forces now under a home ministry, such centralization of power, of coercive power in one ministry? That raises also many troubling questions.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Amit, could I just ask a kind of corollary here? There's also been at least a widespread perception and some data to back it up that post 2014 and the start of this government, the central government has relied more intensively, shall we say, on investigative agencies under their purview to an extent that perhaps we haven't seen before, right? What defenders of this government would say in response is, look, these agencies, Central Bureau of Investigation, Enforcement Directorate, others which are broadly under the law enforcement ambit, they've always been controlled by the political executive, right? For instance, the CBI used to be known as the Congress Bureau of Investigation when the Congress is in power. There's really nothing new here. Do you detect in anything you've researched, data you've seen, that these agencies are being used in a new or different way in the past 8 or 9 years?
Yeah. So, before I come to this question, if I may just add a couple points to what Devesh said, which are also important to highlight. Devesh pointed out, for example, about the expansion of the forces under the Home Ministry. The two really interesting aspects to it. If you look at state employment in general, this expansion is happening at the same time when across different areas, different government departments, public sector employment is actually shrinking in India. And second, also remember that because these are home ministry troops, oftentimes, with the exception of Assam Rifles, they're being led by IPS officers in many instances. And that has actually increased the clout of the Indian police service, the national cadre there. So it has had a very profound impact on the state machinery in that respect. Milan, let me just start by saying that, if you look at the government's record over a period of time in terms of how these agencies like the Central Bureau of Investigation or Enforcement Directorate have been used, they've always been used. What is different now as compared, to earlier times is perhaps that the use has become more energetic and widespread. So, for example, we provide some data on this. So if you compare the current government's record to the last government, which is the UPA government in its second stint between 2009 and 14, and if you look at the ratio of number of cases filed against opposition leaders or their families, and as compared to the cases filed against people from your own party, the governing that ratio of opposition party to governing party was 3-1 under UPA 2, whereas under the BJP government it's gone up to 15-1. So 15. So there is a very substantial increase. And this then, raises two interesting questions from our perspective. One is this aspect. Look, if you look at the Central Bureau of Investigation and the Enforcement Directorate, these are, prestigious organizations. People who serve in these organizations actually take a lot of pride. There is a particular status attached to serving in these organizations, and their credibility rests on their neutrality. And once that neutrality or the perception of neutrality begins to get eroded, then that impacts the prestige of these organizations and the talent you can attract to these organizations. And that's something that we need to be careful about when we think about the effectiveness of the Indian state. I mean, it's the same kind of thing, problem that the Department of Justice faces in the United States. If the perception is that it's targeting a former president for political reasons, whatever the reasons may be, that impacts its credibility because its neutrality has been questioned. So this is a difficult time, and especially given political polarization, for organizations that find themselves in this tug of war. The second aspect of this is it has a very serious implication for federal relations in India, and that's a delicate matter. Opposition parties are in power at the state level, and if opposition politicians are being targeted, then that relationship between the center and the state, that the functionality, its effectiveness, that comes under question. States begin to resist the center's push, and there is tension in that relationship. And then how do you solve serious problems related to internal security where center-state coordination is required? Whether it's criminal investigations, whether it's issues of terrorism, insurgencies, you need center-state coordination for those problems to be solved or to be addressed. And if that relationship is impacted adversely because of use of these central agencies, then that has implications.
So one of the things is that, see, two of the investigative agencies, the CBI actually is not under the Home Ministry, as you know. It's under the Department of Personnel and Training. And the ED, the Enforcement Directorate, is under the Finance Ministry. There is very widespread sense now that the actual ministries don't really exercise control over them. Now, it is true that the nature of Indian politics and political finance, which you've written about, is such that there are skeletons in almost every politician's cupboard. So it's not difficult to find them if you really target them. However, the fact that it's only on opposition parties or almost exclusively on them means that it is the selective nature, right, that makes it so problematic. One of the things we don't realize, as Amit was saying, for the CBI to operate in a state, it needs the authorization of the state. And several states, opposition states, have withdrawn that authorization, which makes investigations, you know, there are lots of investigations that need the cooperation across the country. And over time, if this cooperation, as Amit said, becomes weakened, that definitely undermines, internal security.
So I want to bring this conversation to the question of the police, which is one actor that we haven't talked about yet. And you note in your chapter that in any country, the bedrock of internal security are the civilian police. In India's case, this foundation is the Achilles heel of India's internal security, right? And so it seems to me that there's a kind of catch-22 here, and you talk about this explicitly. On the one hand, the police are corrupt. They're viewed as brutal. They suffer from ineptitude. At the same time, we know they're understaffed. They're under-resourced. They have poor working conditions. They don't have adequate training. They often don't have regular days off. So, Devesh, I guess the question is, are the police essentially trapped in an impossible situation? The definition of a kind of suboptimal equilibrium where they don't perform in the way that we would like, but they also don't have the facilitating conditions present to perform, even if they were sort of, up to the job.
No, I think maybe I was thinking of a term to describe this, what one might call a strategic incompetence. You know, and Milan, what is interesting is you see reports at the state level, central level, about the police right from the late 50s, early 60s, saying exactly what you've said. Every decade, major commission, if you look at the National Police Commission report, which is an extraordinary report, I forget if it runs into 8 or 10 volumes, done in the late 70s in the aftermath. It was the Janta government in the aftermath of the excesses of the police in the emergency that set it up. It looked at every aspect, and it's an amazing report, you know. And after that, there have been multiple other reports, every decade, two, three reports saying exactly this. And for more than 6 decades, every political party has been part of these reports. If you look at the Administrative Reforms Commission, the first in 68, the second in whatever 2003, 4, everyone saying the same thing. Nothing happens. Nothing has happened. Uh, and I think it is one of the most extraordinarily low level equilibriums. I mean, the pay scales, the manner in which the police are treated by many of the politicians as their personal bodyguards. The police in India were brutal to begin with under the British because it was really about order. They didn't care about how. But the fact that that has continued, right, for so long, I think is a real indictment, frankly, on India's political class. Every party, and I want to emphasize, every party has been party like to this. Uh, and it is a deep betrayal of India's people because, and as you know, it's the poor, it's the marginalized who face this the most. They are the ones who are shaken down. They are the ones who get, brutalized. And it's not just the police, because the courts also, we know about the encounter killings as the ones that happened last week, because the courts, take decades to do anything about a mafia don. And there's, one of the things is the only people who get exercised over and encounter killings is a tiny section of the intellectual class. Everyone else is thrilled and happy because they see this deep unfairness built into the system, where the very people who are supposed to sort of guard these citizens, which is the political class, are very much engaged and deeply embedded. They are parts of the mafia themselves.
There has been a pretty raucous debate about the use of so-called encounter killings, right? And we've seen a spate of them in the state of UP involving the mafia politician Atiq Ahmed and his family play out. The UP state government, far from shying away from this form of criminal enforcement, has openly celebrated these killings. And as Devesh points out, UP is not alone, right? I mean, this is kind of standard fare. Tell us a little bit about how we should understand the high degree of public acceptability, or at the very least, if you don't want to say acceptability, indifference to this kind of extrajudicial violence?
No, I think that's a really big question, and actually, the person who should who's best positioned to answer that, Milan, is you, because you've actually looked at this in great detail in your book, in terms of the rise of criminal politicians, for example, and the fact is that these criminal politicians are widely accepted and popular. But the larger point about that observation is correct, that when it comes to encounter killings, when it comes to identity related violence, assassinations, um, there is a lot of public and social acceptability of that violence. And why is that there? Why don't we think about these things differently, especially at a moment when violence has fallen in Indian society? If those indicators are pointing towards that picture of falling violence and relative peace, then having this high level of acceptability is deeply troubling. And some of these Devesh points to, and I want to sort of come back to the work that you've done, that these, for example, criminal politicians win elections. They are popular. They are among their voters. In fact, criminal politicians have a higher likelihood. So, a candidate who has a criminal record has a higher likelihood to get elected than one who does not. But the fact is that if you get elected to office, um, the crime and that image is not washed away. You don't go from being a criminal politician to a saintly politician. And what this is, what the killing of Atiq Ahmed then shows us actually is exactly that sure, they may get elected because of their because of their popularity, but their killing isn't unpopular either. We did not see too many protests after such killings, and encounter killings have happened in the past by the police, again well received. So these are things that we need to sort of ask. But I think from again coming back to the police force and the state machinery, we need to get into this important aspect of what does this mean for the police. Here is a police force that brings these two people to the hospital for a regular medical checkup, and on television cameras, in broad daylight, two people in their custody, who have actually pointed to the courts that look, their lives are threatened, are bumped off. What does this mean for the police? What does it say about their competence? And a lot of police officers have actually have lamented this. I mean, this is something that they worry about, because this again, raises questions about the training, the credibility of the police. What do they stand for when they are not able to protect criminals who are in their custody? And then there is a larger question that Devesh alluded to that comes out of this conversation. Why do these cases, languish in courts for decades? Why do such individuals get political patronage over a period of time? I'm reminded, for example, of when I was doing my field work in Bundelkhand, in the 2000s, there was a dacoit called Dadua. And, during the UP elections, the slogan went around, uh, you know, vote to hathi pe nahi to goli khao chhati pe, which basically translates into vote for the elephant, which was a symbol of the BSP, or take a bullet on your chest. And so this so these kind of relationships that have existed between criminals and politicians, we need to sort of ask questions about those also, when we think about the effectiveness of the police and in this issue of managing violence and just dealing with criminals and criminal politicians.
Devesh, I want to just ask you one thing, because this is something that you have talked about, and I remember you and I having a conversation about this a long time ago. Private security forces. I was stunned to see some of the numbers in your book. They are the 11th largest sector in India by employment, private security forces. The ratio of private to public security providers is 5-1. How do you understand the surge in private security forces, right? I mean, is this just a factor of, economic growth, and there's a greater demand for, people living in gated communities, for shops to have protection, inadequate police, and are there any downside consequences to this?
Milan, yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think where on sort of day-to-day security, right, which is the what the police are supposed to provide, when there's a perception that uh, that is weak or limited, then people will find other ways, right? One of the reasons that these dons, these mafia dons, rose, and as you very nicely showed in your book, was they also provided protection to marginalized communities. And I think so. So one of the things is that in these, the private security is less about preventing or checking violence. It's more about things like theft and robberies, uh, and harassment, say in a mall, or as you said, a gated community. In some cases, which is the ubiquitous chowkidar, right? Uh, it is because it's a status symbol as well. In other cases, for instance, the large increase in ATM machines that occurred right over the past 20 years. So what happened was ATM machines, you needed to, of course, replenish their cash. So you got these specialized firms that transport these large amounts of cash, right? Which are private from the RBI's vaults to these ATMs. So there's a variety of reasons, I think, drive. I mean, I think urbanization is surely driving part of it, because urbanization is leading to these housing colonies, gated communities, etc. So the nature of urbanization, the nature of urban policing or lack thereof, all of these are playing sort of into this.
So I want to kind of bring this conversation to a close by asking you to reflect on kind of what are the broader questions that this work raises, and you touch upon this at the end of the chapter. You talk about the work of anthropologist Thomas Blom Hansen, right? And he has a book which argues that what's changed in India is that violence has moved from the periphery of Indian politics and Indian life to center stage. And this, on its face, seems to fly in the face of all the data that you've produced, which shows, look, violence of all kinds is on the decline. I'm wondering, Amit, maybe I'll start with you. How do we understand these conflicting assessments, right? Violence is moving from the periphery to center stage, but yet the numbers we have suggest that public violence is on the decline. Is there a way to sort of circle this square?
No, so I think what is important to understand here is that the decline in violence um, across indicators needs to be interpreted carefully because it may not necessarily mean a decline in fear and the fear of violence. And so there is something to be said about things today, circumstances today that may be perpetuating that fear of violence. There is also a memory of violence. Let's remember that oftentimes when major violent acts have happened in India, um, those are not actually dealt with in terms of a discussion, reconciliation. And so the memory of violence remains. It remains with people. It is, and it nurtures resentment over a period of time. So, some of these things we need to consider. And the fact of the matter is that when it comes to people's daily lives, whether it's related to caste or gender, or just getting on with their daily lives, people still live with a fair amount of fear. And we know that when we think about people going to work, or especially when you think about gender participation in the workforce, we know that's a concern, that security and safety is a concern for women.
I think one is to take on Amit's thing about memory. I think last week a court set free, I think there were these major riots in Meerut in 1983, 82, or 83, where the PSC, the Provincial Armed Constabulary of UP, was clearly involved in the killings of Muslims. It took 4 decades for those trials, 4 decades, and the outcome was that no one was found guilty. Right now, when more than 100 people are killed and no one is found guilty, and it takes you 4 decades, there is something pretty seriously wrong. Uh, I think I think part of the reason of squaring the circle of Thomas Blom-Hansen, I think the idea that violence was in the periphery, I don't frankly agree with that. Meaning, if you look at one thing, caste violence, right? I mean, the 50s, if you were a Dalit, I mean, surely violence was not on the periphery like for you. It's the gradual empowerment of Dalits through the political process that in rural India, it's just not that easy to engage in violence against Dalits in the way the upper caste could so easily do it 60 years ago. I mean, that I think is a fundamental change. The other reason why I think we see it more in the public is that social media has a massive megaphone effect, right? Because everyone, previously a lot of these discussions about violence would occur in private spaces, right? People talking in a tea shop, it's confined there and would use abusive language, but it stays there. Now the abusive language comes out in social media, goes viral, and everyone thinks, wow, so much violence. I think I do think that the manner in which social media has been weaponized in this sense is, and what are the answers, how to address it. I mean, it's not unique to India, but it's definitely one reason why the publicness of violence appears to have increased, even though seemingly that the data is showing that it's going the other way.
Yeah. And Milan, if I may just quickly add to that, just the idea of violence being on the periphery. I mean, we have chapters, really nice chapters on the legal infrastructure in India. And that legal infrastructure clearly stands with the state and has a strong preference for order. And or when it comes to issues of national security, every time the governments have made that case, the courts have sided with the government. And that, that particular view, judicial view, is very much a product of issues of violence and order being not at the periphery, but actually at the center. Even as early as when the constitutional debates were happening, because that's the moment when, India is coming apart. The partition violence and the number of people who are killed, the displacement, that has left a very deep impression on the Indian state at a founding moment. So in that sense, it's never been at the periphery. And then, if you go to insurgency hit states, no one there will argue that violence has been at the periphery.
One of the things about ruling elites is even if they don't act, they must be seen to act in not condoning violence, right? In at least stating that they are horrified by violence, or right, even if, as we discuss in our book, their actions are way more feeble than their words. But when you don't even use words, right, then it almost gives a tacit acceptance of certain practices, and that, I think, is extremely worrisome.
My guests on the show this week are the political scientists Amit, Ahuja, and Devesh Kapur. Together, they have edited a new book, Internal Security in India, Violence, Order, and the State. The book covers topics ranging from the public finances of internal security to the military's role, to the role of the Central Armed Police Forces, riots, includes contributors like Srinath Raghavan, Akshay Mangala, Sahana Ghosh, Paul Stanland. It's really a kind of who's who of the India security set. Devesh and Amit, thank you so much for this book, and thanks for taking the time to talk to me about it.
Thanks, Milan.
Thank you so much for having us on your show, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Nithya Lab. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Isabel Villegas is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production, brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.